Ladies and gentlemen, worldwide every folk, welcome to the show. Get ready to meet your host for the night, Arizona's very own hip historian himself, Marshall Shore.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to our program, Trans History, right here in Arizona. So this is done with as the third Saturday with Virtual Arizona Pride, which they've been doing since April. So happy to be presenting again on some really cool Arizona history. Now, my name is Marshall Shore. I'm also known as the Hip Historian. And you might wonder, how does one get a name like the Hip Historian? Well, a little over 20 years ago, I was working in a library in Brooklyn, and you know what? It was bitterly cold and snowing, and so decided to load everything we own into a big orange cube, and there is my partner, Paul. And so we loaded everything up in that cube, and their International World Headquarters are right here in the Valley of the Sun. And so we decided it was time to someplace sunny, and that would have been right here in Phoenix, Arizona. And so we promptly moved into a beautiful 1956 ranch that is now a lovely two-tone of seafoam and cantaloupe. And so it really is pretty much a time capsule. There's what my kitchen looks like today. So, I kind of spend a lot of time looking at the past. I wake up looking at it, and that's pretty much what I spend my days trying to piece together mysteries and things like that. Now, when I first moved here to Arizona, all I kept hearing about was there was no history here. But I knew that wasn't true because every time I went somewhere, I came face to face with so many amazing stories. And then, like on a day like today, so this is the anniversary of air conditioning. So this is Dr. Carrier, the man who invented it. And so a long time ago, he put it together. And so, without him, we would not be enjoying our lovely time here in Arizona at this moment. Now, also, the Phoenix New Times has named me Best Historian several years running, as well as the Phoenix New Times, as well as the Phoenix Magazine named me the best bespectacled Phoenix celebrity because I am attached to my eyewear. So, when people kept saying there was no history here, at first I kind of bought into that. And then I went on vacation, and then let's do this. So I went on vacation at one point and ran across one of these muscle magazines from the 50s. Not that unusual, but as I was flipping through, I was rather shocked to find an ad. And so it was for a local artist, and I was really shocked to get down to the very bottom, and let's see. And it doesn't really focus very well, but indeed, his studio was right here in Phoenix, Arizona. So it really got me thinking, there is a history here that people just aren't aware of. And so it really was a moment for me to just kind of reflect and go back to what is that? And so several years ago, we started the Arizona LGBT plus History Project as really a way to start kind of gathering that history, to really promote the facilitation, protection, and preservation of those materials. I am happy to say it is a collaboration between ASU Libraries, which houses the B.J. Budd Archives, as well as the History Project itself sits under Phoenix Pride. Now, it was created. Now, actually, if you want to, you can follow us on Facebook, which is AZ Gay History. If you are watching this on Facebook, if you would not mind, please clicking on the little share button so that way other folks know that we're talking about some really cool history. So we all are aware, hopefully we're all aware, back in 1969, there was an event called Stonewall. This little unassuming building became kind of the epicenter or the focal point of the LGBTQ civil rights movement. Now, it was by no means the first riot, nor even the last. I mean, if you take a look, you've also got the Cooper Donut riots back in 67. You have, oh, those are 59. The Cooper Union, Black Cat in LA was 67, as well as in 66, there was the Compton cafeteria riots out in San Francisco. And, and those were really those moments where those marginalized communities, drag queens, lesbians, hustlers, a little bit everybody, they had realized they had reached a breaking point of that harassment, of being oppressed, arrested. And so they fought back. This was the one that the media kind of grabbed a hold of and that we all know today. Today, if you go visit, it's actually now a landmark with a plaque and everything. So that means it's official. But, when you start looking at Arizona, a lot of times we get left out of that because we're not one of those big cities. A lot of times people think we don't have that history. In fact, there was a survey that was done of all archives across the state and found out that LGBTQ materials were grossly underrepresented. So that's part of why this was taken on. Now and also, and just a few days ago, we had International Non-Binary Awareness Day. And so, and that's really when I say the word trans, it's really using it more as that umbrella term to cover a lot of different communities that fall within that. Now, the History Project came about because of the demolition of a building that originally was a bar over at 307 Roosevelt. And what I love here is this is an ad. And you can kind of see how times and language change. So here you have this ad talking about how the place was fancy, gay, and friendly. Now, I'm pretty sure they had very little meaning towards gay as we look at it now. But the fact, I still love kind of how language changes and how this ad is probably even more aware of than it was. And so the 307, there actually was a fire. And so they moved to 222 Roosevelt and became the iconic 307 Lounge. So we do know from about probably the 50s up until 2000, it was a very active space. It was also famous for DeGrauzy murals. And so here you have Miss Ebony and Pussy LaHoot both performing, and the photo of Pussy LaHoot, you can actually see those DeGrauzy murals behind her. Now, he was an artist. This was really early in his career, and he was looking for just a way to drink cheap. And the story goes that I've heard it is as long as he was painting, his drinks were free. So the building was full of DeGrauzy murals. Now, when the building was demolished, there actually was a plaque inset into the concrete along Roosevelt and 2nd Street, commemorating the fact that the 307 Lounge was there at one point and was a safe space for the LGBTQ community, as well as honoring those DeGrauzy murals. Now, right around the corner from that, in the mid-70s, you have another club that opened up, and that was Cruisin' Central. And that really became more than just a bar. It was really a place in the community where a lot of trans or other community folks could come and just kind of hang their wig and hang out and relax. It closed in the early 2000s. And so it literally is right around the corner from where the 307 was as well. And so this year, actually in June, we produced the LGBTQ walking tour of downtown. So actually, if you Google that, you'll come up with the list. And it is a list of, I think, gosh, I want to say 11 sites kind of around that Roosevelt downtown area, kind of talking about our history. And that's really one of the reasons why we have then the Rainbow Crosswalk that's right there on Portland. Because of that, it was also a very active cruise grounds from the mid 40s to about the mid 90s. And right across the street, Miss Ed was telling me at one point that right across the street from the 307 was another gathering place, and that was mainly for the trans sex workers. Now, you know, it's kind of hard to take a rainbow crosswalk on the road. So tried to figure out, how do we start sharing some of this amazing history with people around the state? So we actually devised with the Arizona Historical Society and created these panels. We basically rolled those out last year in Bisbee. Gosh, hard to believe that was over a year ago. My gosh. And so we spent probably a little over 6 months kind of piecing these together. Now, when I first said, you know, let's talk about the trans history of Arizona, I wasn't really quite even sure what we would find. But I knew once we started hitting the pavement and working with folks that we would find some really great stories, which we did. And so we involved not just the Arizona Historical Society, but also the Louise Lawrence Transgender Archive and the Digital Transgender Archive. And folks like Kendra at Transspectrum were a huge help in putting this together. A whole slew of volunteers, not just locally, but also out in San Francisco and other places throughout the country. Really, it was kind of just starting to ask some of those questions and really kind of getting people to start talking about things. And actually, if I remember, I'll actually talk about some of the changes that it's caused as well. Now, one of the issues we have is that we really don't have much of a print history. When you start looking at just the LGBT community, really in the mid 70s is when you start having those newsletters that are by the LGBT community for the LGBT community. Before that, we had to rely on mainstream press. And a lot of times it wasn't very nice. They tended to just promote the negative things. A lot of times you wind up those raids. You also had the fact that if there was a raid and you were caught, your name was published in there and you would lose your family, your career, everything. So this was really kind of a monumental task to do, to start these publications. So you have like the Observer, which is the first LGBTQ press in Arizona, followed by the Pride of Phoenix, and then BJ Budd, Sunday's Child newsletter. And then in the 80s, you wind up with A Rose, which was formed by transgendered women. And later in the 80s, they also joined Alpha Zeta, which was a support group for transvestites, transgender people, and transsexuals. And so it really was a support group, and they had a newsletter. And we've been able to find a few of these, but not quite as much as we would love to find. And be able to use them as resources. Then you also have things like Saga, which was created in the late 80s. It grew out of Wingspan, which was a Southern Arizona LGBT community center. During a meeting of Desert Boys, which was a support group for primarily folks born into bodies that weren't identified as female at birth. And it grew into, then there was also a group, Desert Girls, but they realized they needed something more. And so they created the Southern Arizona Gender Alliance. And to show you how strong they were, the following year, Tucson actually added gender identity into their pre-existing local ordinance protecting residents from discrimination based on sexual orientation. And so that's really important, the fact that they were able to get that in so early. So a lot just happens word of mouth. And so that's a lot of times what we wind up doing is just sitting down and chatting and doing oral histories with people so that we really kind of start capturing that history that wasn't captured by those presses, because it goes much further back. And also people connect things that other print materials didn't. Now, one of the things that I've started doing is, so I've taken the panel that you see, actually, if you can look behind me, you'll see part of that panel, part of that display that we unveiled in Bisbee. And actually we were supposed to take to Yuma this year, which didn't happen because of all this stuff that we're in right now. But that's why I'm happy that we can do this now. So what I did, I thought, well, let's make this a little fun. So let's do it as a trivia game. So I think we've got 11 questions. I don't, I just finished them, and you'd think I'd remember actually how many questions I had. And hey, Eddie, great to see you, Sister Naviho, and Ian and Kim, indeed. Mel's brother did indeed do the logo for Cruisin' Central, that if you go over to Cruisin' 7th, when they open again, you can actually, on the wall is that original Cruising Central sign that he created for them. So I thought it would be kind of fun to set this up as a trivia game. So if you want to, you can play along. You can either grab a pen and paper and start filling it out, or, type it here in the chats. And so that way people can keep track of. Now, because some of these are rather obscure, the whole idea is not to show how much any one person knows or doesn't know, but it really is a way to start sharing these stories as a way to educate us about our own history. And, and also, please, at the end, we'll have a chance to chat. And if you have questions, that's what the chat is there for. So please go ahead and throw those things in. So our first trivia question, Pearl Hart was known as a female what? Was she an A, a fire person, B, a stagecoach robber, C, a police person, or D, a circus clown? So Pearl Hart, who actually goes way back into Arizona history, and winds up her story gets told a lot, but not all of her story. All right, so on to number 2. Pedro Warro was detained in what city for wearing women's clothing? Was it A, Apache Junction, B, Tucson, C, Globe, D, Phoenix? Which one of those cities was Pedro Warro detained? And only because he was wearing women's clothing. Number 3, what Phoenix lesbian bar did the famous drag queen Ray Bourbon perform in? Was it A, Kay's Happy Landing Buffet, B, Roy's, C, La Jolla, or D, the Cotillion Room? Okay. So question 4. To prevent illegal activities, the Arizona Department of Liquor License and Control barred who from liquor selling establishments? Was it A, pickpockets, B, gangsters, C, swindlers, or D, female impersonators? Which one of those groups were banned from local liquor selling establishments? What Arizona movie theater held a male film festival? Was it A, the Orpheum, B, the Rialto, C, Valley Art, or D, the Silver Dollar? Which one of those movie theaters held a male film festival? What group of diverse queer nuns are colorfully devoted to community service? A, Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, B, Lesbian Nuns in Silence, C, Queers for Croquet, or D, Apollo's Motorcycle Club? And question 7, what Scottsdale dance club banned trans patrons? Was it A, Axis Radius, B, Devil House, C, Paris, or D, Anderson's Fifth Estate? Question 8. Millie Carter Bloodworth has written a book about her life. True or false? Question 9. We're coming to the home stretch. Only a couple more questions left. And maybe a surprise if I can figure that part out, but we'll get there. Where did Monica Helms design the transgendered pride flag? Where was it designed? Was it A, Tucson, B, Phoenix, C, Yuma, or D, Flagstaff? Where did Monica Helms design that flag? Where was Arizona's first Two-Spirit powwow held? A, Northern Arizona University, B, Phoenix College, C, University of Arizona, or D, South Mountain Community College? Question 11. Where was the 1906 gender pioneer buried? In Phoenix, where was he born? Was it A, Austria, B, France, C, Russia, or D, China? Name the Arizona singer that sang about his love for another man. And this is our last question. So was it A, Clay Aiken, B, Andy Bell, C, Troy Walker, or D, Boy George? Now, of course, I am going to go through all these answers. So I will give you a moment to kind of settle yourselves. I get myself another drink of water. All right. So Pearl Hart was known as our only female stagecoach robber. Now, what's interesting, I think, a lot about Pearl Hart is we're looking at, you're talking 1899. Well before Arizona was a state. And the fact that she did indeed help hold up a stagecoach. But most of her life, she actually was dressed as a man. She had a few years where you can obviously see she dressed as a woman. Now, let's see if we do this. So that way you can get a better shot of some of these photos. So you can see there she is. She was married for a very short period of time. Most of her life, she actually was spent dressed in masculine clothing. Actually, when she was very young, her and her sister were caught stealing a watermelon and thrown into a boys' detention center up until it was discovered that they weren't boys. Now, because of kind of her crime and almost infamy, her story gets retold a lot, but a lot of times what gets left out is that she ever dressed as a boy. So I think it's important to say that even though we sometimes know the history, we don't necessarily know all the history. So Pedro Warro was detained in what city for wearing women's clothing? So what I think is interesting about this is we were talking the 20s. And here we have two different articles that you often find mainstream press can be quite salacious. I mean, here we have one article that was talking about the arrest of a female impersonator back in the 20s, as well as then, or the other article, which talks about Globe has a freak. And all because this young gentleman was caught wearing women's clothing. Now, he was passing as a woman for quite a while. And it kind of gets brought up a little bit. That probably was not his real name. I've actually been trying to track down his story to see where it goes, but haven't been able to find any more information about him. And, and this was not the only case we found of this. There were other spots across the state where a variety of folks were detained, in some cases even thrown in jail, just because they were wearing women's clothing. There was one man in Yuma who basically was told to either pay a fine and get out of town or spend time in jail. So he chose to pay the fine and just get out of Dodge, which he did. All right. So what Phoenix lesbian bar did the famous drag queen Ray Bourbon perform in? It was a Kay's Happy Landing buffet. Now, you might be wondering, if you've never heard of Ray Bourbon, he was really popular in really the 20s and 30s, was really had several records. And so actually all the bars that were listed there are all bars in Arizona that he performed in. Now, Ray Bourbon was famous for his monologues, his singing. He also did lead quite a unique. He was also convicted of being involved as an accomplice to murder. And Kay's Happy Landing. So Kay Elledge, who actually had owned Kay's Happy Landing buffet, had actually been one of his musicians when he would perform around the country. So that's one of the reasons why he would come and perform at this little tiny upstairs bar in South Phoenix. Now, Kay was known as, I would say, what you would classically call a bull dyke. She was very short, very gruff, and her girlfriend Violet was on the very other end of that spectrum, was very much a femme fatale. And from what I've heard in stories, that was really what Kay preferred, was very much sticking to those gender roles. Now, this bar that opened up in South Phoenix was there in the early 40s. Probably not a place where you'd expect to find a lesbian bar. Now, Kay and Violet, actually Violet's husband was killed in the war. And so they used that insurance money to then open up Kay's Happy Landing buffet. All right, so question 4. Now, actually, this is a little bit of a trick question because you had a variety of folks listed, swindlers, pickpockets, and other folks. It was actually any of those. And what was interesting was it was basically gangsters, swindlers, pickpockets, female impersonators. It was lumping them all together. So I've been trying to figure out why were all these folks, including female impersonators, banded together. I did find this was in the late 40s. A decade earlier, the exact same kind of ordinance was passed in New Jersey. So now I know to go back and try and track down a connection between New Jersey and Arizona and this Department of Liquor Licensing and Control. All right. So, what Arizona Movie Theater held a male film festival? It was Valley Arts out in Tempe. This was actually just a few months before Stonewall. And I started trying to track down some of these movies. You had things like Butch and Nellie, Fanny's Hill, Gay Fantasies, Drag Queen and Her Guest, Lavender Boy of the Month. And so the only ones I can actually find right now are Butch and Nellie and Fanny's Hill, which I was only able to locate through an erotic index and find a little bit about them. So I'm now trying to find more. I really was hoping that Drag Queen and Her Guest was referring back to, if any of you have seen on Netflix, it may have migrated to YouTube by now, The Queen, which is done in 1968, which is about a kind of the whole drag scene. There's a drag competition happening in New York City in the late 60s. I was really hoping it was that, but it doesn't look like it. So now I'm in hot pursuit trying to find some of these other movies. And then what group of diverse queer nuns? Indeed, is our own Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. Now, back in 2007, the Grand Canyon Sisters started up as a chapter of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. They are a nonprofit and they support empowerment of the LGBT community across Arizona through entertainment and fundraising. Now, their unique identities of dressing in nun habits and face really play into even an earlier history of HIV and AIDS. It started off in San Francisco when even showing support or protesting organizations could really be damaging to folks. And so they came up with this whole idea of face as a way to protect their identities. So I love that the sisters carry on that bit of history so that we can all share in that. Even if you don't know the history, you can at least enjoy the look. And I just love all the colors and the personalities of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence right here in the Grand Canyon Sisters chapter. Watts Scottsdale Dance Club banned trans patrons. Anderson's Fifth Estate. Now, this would have been in 2006. They actually had issues with patrons complaining about folks using the bathroom and having cross-dressers in there. So it kind of becomes, I mean, this was really the first time it raised its head, but not the last time that it raised its head. And so even the Scottsdale Human Rights Commission got involved in this. They were not able to come to a resolution, and eventually the club just closed down. But because of that fight that the city was immersed in as well, the council voted to add sexual orientation and sexual identity to their employment codes back in 2007. So I love to see that progression of how something comes up and communities and government agencies actually then fall in line to support each other. And does Millie Carter Bloodworth have a book? Indeed, she does. The Exceptional Impossible Woman. Indeed. Now, sadly, it is out of print, but I think Millie may still have a few copies floating around. The other picture there was when the Arizona Republic did a transgendered language community dialogue series that was really fantastic. They had a whole host of folks talking about how language is in the media, some of the issues. Now, also, Miss Millie has been kind of an icon here in the Phoenix LGBTQ scene. She moved here. Well, she moved here in the 70s and started transitioning in the early 70s as well. Then she went off and studied nursing, did a brief stint in the army, but then came back and was one of the first people to start really caring for folks with HIV and AIDS back when that pandemic was hitting our community. Now, she did retire from education and is still very supportive and still very much an activist for her communities. Now, where did Monica Helms design the trans flag? It was right here in Phoenix. Now, I do think it's also really cool that that flag that she designed, the original one, is now in the Smithsonian. So people can go visit if they would like to. And so here we have Monica and her lovely wife. Now, she was the year before, she was actually one of the grand marshals of the Pride Parade. And so there actually was a declaration of it being Transgendered Flag Day by Kate Gallego. Now, Monica also has written a book about herself because, she has quite an interesting history. I mean, not only is she a native Phoenician, but she's a veteran of the United States Navy. Now, the first time the flag actually was visible in a parade was the 2000 Pride Parade. She went on a few years later to that to found the Transgendered American Veterans Association, TAVA. So if you'd like to know more about Monica and kind of her journey, you can read about it in her book, which I know is on Amazon. And where was Arizona's first Two-Spirit powwow held? The South Mountain Community College. It was done in conjunction with Native PFLAG and was the first one in Arizona. Now, my other half, Paul, is actually right now he's teaching in China, off in Shanghai. And so he was able to attend Shanghai Pride. And one of the things I loved is he did go to a workshop. And so even in China, they were talking about the whole idea of Two-Spirit and how it is a very old, it's a new term for very much an old philosophy of folks that kind of lived outside of what we would say now are two genders. A lot of times those Two-Spirit folks were given tasks that related to the gender they were living in. So sometimes they were allowed to, say, name a child. So they were really treated or even exalted because of their community status and the jobs they could do in those. And so it's really great to be able to see things like the Two-Spirit powwow, where that is now celebrated across so many communities. I mean, and I love the fact that the idea of Two-Spirit does not just have meaning here, but people across the globe are now looking at that concept as well as that history. I mean, this was something that many tribes held as a core value that was then altered. And so it's great to see that belief system coming back and respecting of each other. Where was the 1906 gender pioneer buried in Phoenix? Where was he born? Nikolai Durelin was born in Russia. Now here is a photo of him in Chicago. So we don't know exactly what age he came to the US, but that's around the time he started dressing as a young man. And he actually was married, wound up getting a divorce because he was too enamored with chorus girls. Wife number 2 was indeed a chorus girl. But then he contracted tuberculosis. And like so many people across the country, when that happened, they came to Arizona for our clean air. Shocking to see how that could have been. At some point, we actually were known for our air quality being good. And so it didn't go so well for Nikolai. And so he passed away a few months after living here. And when he was taken to the undertakers, they started prepping for burial and discovered that Nikolai was indeed born a woman. And so they buried him here in Phoenix. But because of his birth gender, he was buried in a dress and without a headstone. Now, it said that in his will, he left all of his money to his wife, and the courts deemed because he was a woman, he couldn't be married to another woman, so his money then wound up eventually going to his mother, who he was estranged from. So I'm happy to say that after about a year and a half, almost 2 years of working with the cemetery, that we did an event to commemorate Nikolai. And now there is indeed a headstone for Nikolai. That folks from Transspectrum, as well as you saw my friend Ace there in the photo as well, put together kind of the look. And then Erica Kepler, I think, came up with the quote as we were sitting there trying to figure out what should we say about it. And trying also to make sure that the headstone kind of fit in the time period of that 1906. Now, the quote on the headstone reads, "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." And it was Ralph Waldo Emerson. So I love the fact that it was so funny because I was out at the cemetery at one point and there was no headstone. And then I was just out there for another event and I'm walking around and I suddenly realized I can't find where Nikolai's grave is. And it was because indeed there was a headstone there. So that's been really great. And that was all funded by the community to make sure that Nikolai is now identified and his story is no longer an unknown. In fact, the Arizona Republic came to the commemoration ceremony we did and did a great article. And because of that, I actually got connected to a author in Russia who has written a book on Nikolai. She was researching actually something else, found his story, and became enamored with it because it is quite an amazing story. All right. So the name for the singer that sang about his love for another man, "Happiness is a Thing Called Joe," was the song, which was a cover of a Judy Garland song. And Troy, who actually grew up in Chandler, went off to the Air Force and in Yuma got his voice discovered. He did one album, was actually his second album was supposed to be, he had a contract for it, so it was supposed to go without a hitch, except that the song "Happiness is a Thing Called Joe" was there. And they wouldn't record it because it was a man singing about his love for another man. Now, also at this point, also Troy's boyfriend at the time, whose name was Joe, and he wound up finally getting that album published, but he wound up actually having to self-publish it, produce it. In the 60s, he wound up moving to Hollywood and actually wound up performing in a variety of clubs there up until just a few years ago, things like the Palomino Club. Now, what I think is interesting also about Troy is he was known because he was so effeminate. And a lot of times people would talk about how in his photos, they couldn't tell it was a man. And so he would show up on stage in the 60s and like just come out full on and say things like, "Mama wanted a girl, Daddy wanted a boy. And you know what? They got me. And so they're both happy." So he was very much a queer identity early on. when I was searching for more information about Troy, I did discover the Queer Music Heritage Archive, which is an amazing resource and so much fun to listen to things from the 20s. I mean, he's really done a great job of cataloging this stuff and trying to get as much information as he can. And so when I was trying to find more information about Troy, I came across there was recently a documentary on him done called Troy, the Original Lady Boy. So now I'm trying to track down how do we get that shown here in Phoenix, which I think would be really fun, and maybe try to even get him here. Now, I've not done this before, so bear with me for a moment because I'm going to try and play Happiness is a Thing Called Joe. I want to do it towards the end of the program, so in case we lose any volume, because I do not own the copyright to this, so we shall see what happens. I kind of shy away from playing music, but I thought it would be so kind of fun and important to do.
It seems like happiness. Happiness is just a little thing called Joe. Now Joe, he's got a way that makes the lilacs wanna grow. You know, little Joe, he's got a way that makes all the angels heave a sigh when they know that little Joe is passing by. Sometimes the cabin's gloomy, the table may be a little bare, but then Joe, he'll kiss you, and it's Christmas everywhere.
Okay, so you can kind of see why indeed he was singing about his love for another man, and why some folks would have been upset by that in the early 60s. Now, you know, he is not the only famous gender fluid performer to actually grace Arizona. And in fact, here we have, so I was recently, Gerald from San Francisco with the LGBT History Museum posted this the other day, the He-She Follies, which took place in the early 90s out in San Francisco and featured such folks as Justin Bond or Justin Vivian Bond, but it also has folks like Elvis Herselvis, who actually grew up here in Phoenix and wound up dressing up as Elvis for a Halloween party, as you can see in that middle photo, and then wound up moving to San Francisco and creating the whole persona of Elvis Herselvis, where she then kind of traveled around the country playing Elvis, singing Elvis songs, and she is still performing today. In fact, I just saw her. She was doing there was a group that did an LGBT walking tour, a virtual walking tour of San Francisco queer history, which was pretty amazing. And then also in that same show was Miss X. Now, Miss X came to some amount of fame by being in Vegas in Space, being one of the production crew as well as one of the actors. And so Miss X actually lives right here in Phoenix. So happy to say that these folks have graced Arizona stages and did an event a couple of years ago. And I was so excited to then also bring on to the stage with them Eddie Broadway. So kind of that old guard meets the new guard. I mean, Eddie has graced many of the stages around Arizona as well as across the country. I mean, in 2017, he was Mr. US of A, male illusionist. He has also been the Emperor 8 at the Imperial Court of Arizona. He is currently Mr. Trans USA for 2020, as well as in 2014, he was Mr. Phoenix Pride. And happy to say a friend as well. So this has been really fun kind of a project to put together. We're already started talking about other panels to add because of course it was done a few years ago. And so things change. Other stories came up. I mean, you have elections, Brianna Westbrook almost winning. I mean, doing a really good race and still being very politically active. As well as one of the great things was with like the Digital Trans Archive, when we were talking about like A Rose, that newsletter, we only were able to find one virtual copy of it in the Midwest, but happy because we made those connections. You can now find it by going to the Digital Transgender Archive. And also in that she was Miss Bobby, who is with the Louise Lawrence Transgender Archive. Now, funding for this also came from Whole World View, and the Arizona Historical Society was instrumental in bringing this together and creating. They had already created kind of the idea of the history panels, but then able to step up and say, yes, let's do one that is focused on LGBTQ history for Arizona, which a lot of people think we don't have much, but indeed we do. So are there any questions? Do people have, I mean, also I will throw my email out there. And so please, if you have stories, if you have ideas for panels and things we can put together, would love to hear your suggestions. Right now working on a couple panels, one of which is kind of that small town LGBTQ experience here in Arizona, as well as doing one on kind of the changing face of drag. How does it look different? And that would be a panel, and having some of those performers come on and talk about what they're doing now. So if you have ideas for other panels, I know Ian and I have talked about a couple different ideas for things as well. So looking forward to being able to continue doing more panels, hopefully doing at least once a month. So, but really this cannot happen without you all out there providing information, stories. Sometimes, I mean, we did I do an Arizona History Happy Hour. And so it was great because it made her pull out her scrapbooks and go through that and look for it. So Mari, you bring up a good point. So when you're looking historically, we really don't know what her pronoun she would have chosen because that's not an option. And actually, let me actually, I just learned this little trick so I can actually make this noticeable. So it's talking about how with Pearl Hart, the fact that I do use she and her for her, that's actually one of the things when you start looking historically, because the terms we use now, they didn't have those options. They didn't have the opportunity to choose their pronouns. So we really don't know what many of them would have chosen. And so that even came through with looking at Nikolai, working with him, was in his headstone trying to, as he would have wanted it to be still very much a secret. The only reason why we know about it is because things didn't go as planned. And so historically, we don't really have that option of being able to ask them what they would like, as happens today. So, and the fact that I've yet to find Pearl going by any other name other than Pearl Hart, by a masculine name, or even a question in terms of her own, which she would prefer, but she often was in men's clothing. So that was a great question, Mars. Thank you so much for that. Because that's always something we deal with, especially dealing with folks we can't talk to, is trying to read between the lines. Sometimes it's trying to find stories where at the onset, when you look at it, there might not be a story there, but once you start getting into it, and that's really where those personalized stories become so important, or even that folklore of really being able to share and getting to know a little bit more about a character than what would have just been in print, because those were usually such stripped down, or as we saw in the one case of Pedro, extremely offensive, basically just coming out and calling him a freak. But then you do have the other one that says, you know, he was caught doing this, and was much more factual. And in some cases, you need both of those to really try to create more of an image. Sometimes you don't even have that, so it really is just hearsay. So that's a lot of the time some of the questions. So thank you so much for that, Mars. Anything else that somebody would like to bring up or talk about? I mean, we're coming up to, oh, wow. It's like, so we've almost been doing this an hour. So, you know, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I am definitely passionate about trying to find as much history as we can. So if any of you have leads, please let me know. And, oh, of course, Mars, there's, you know, as a librarian, I love questions. So, but yeah, so if you have any ideas of things you would like to see, I mean, trying to do at least one program a month so that we can always find more, because, you know, one of my goals of really even doing this trans display was trying to get more stories, because all we're really, it's like a lot of times we're just getting local stories, Phoenix. And it was really great because I kept talking to a friend about this, and he finally said, well, you know, back in 1906, my grandmother actually took in this kid from the neighborhood who had been constantly harassed, beaten up, and kind of took him under her wing. And this was in the barrio down in Tucson, and said, you know, it came out that he wanted to wear one of grandma's dresses. So gave him one of grandma's dresses to wear. And so he's trying to find in the family photo album a group photo with that young man wearing one of grandma's dresses. So, and for me, this is really all about trying to get more information, more stories, more ephemera that really kind of help us create that more of a history, because I think that helps us create our own identity. If we understand how we got here, then that helps us react to that community. And also realizing that, you know, we are only able to be here and doing what we're doing because we're all standing on the shoulders of, oh, so many other folks that gave up so much and fought so many battles so that we could do things like sit here and talk about trans history here in Arizona, which some places they can't. I mean, it was interesting. It's like hearing some of the stuff from Paul when he was going to Shanghai Pride. He was at one point in a room and he said a bunch of folks had these buttons that had a picture of a camera on it with a big slash through it. And that was because they did not want their photos taken because of where they were working. And that if a photo got out of them at a Pride event, they would lose their jobs without a doubt. And so this really goes back to some of those earlier prides that we had, some of those events where they would have a box. And if you stood in that box, you weren't allowed to be photographed. He also was in rooms of 20 people and heard people say in the room they had never seen so many gay people all in one space before. So, you know, not everywhere has some of the freedoms that we have. So that's part of talking about the history. And that's why I was so excited when Paul sent me those slides of the presentation he went to, really looking at that global history of LGBTQ+. And what does that mean for not just their community, but really looking at that global community. All right, so thank you all so much for joining us. Please do let me know if you have anything you'd like to share. So my name is Marshall Shore. I am the project manager for the Arizona LGBT+ History Project. I also do the Arizona History Happy Hour every Thursday night, where we explore all kinds of fun Arizona history. If you would like to reach out, there is my email. You can also do hello@hiphistorian.com to track me down. You can take a look at our website at www.azlgbthistory.org. So please reach out to me. Let me know what you thought of the program. Let me know if you think there are things that I should have talked about, because there's a lot more I could have talked about. So again, thank you all so much for being here, and hopefully we'll see you around, and have a great rest of your day. This will also be archived on YouTube and Facebook, so I will post the links for those. And have a great rest of your day. Try and stay cool and safe and healthy.